Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you this morning.
Good morning. Everything's okay over there?
It is okay. We ended up unexpectedly, I guess, taking last week off because from posting podcast.
Right,
I ended up being out of town, but it was Easter weekend, and
right.
I ended up being out of town and stuff. And so glad to be back and to talk about a really interesting topic today.
Yeah, it's something. We have a friend in Scotland who specializes in this stuff. Haven't talked to him for a while, but um, he specializes in these things. We don't talk a lot about this topic, at least not on the podcast, but it's something we talk quite a bit about in our private practice, in our practice, especially when we're doing couples therapy and marriage counseling and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
We've entitled this Man to Man, Mano a Mano.
Mhm.
We are men talking to men.
Mhm.
And so,
Yeah, and I think it's such an important topic because I think that you know, well, as we'll get into some of these specifics, and actually, this is going to be a two-parter
mhm.
because of some of the things we're going to talk about. But so often men tend to be a population that we don't see as much in therapy. Most of the people that we see in therapy are either women or kids. And so it's nice to see and a man come in to work with them and help them sort of understand a little bit more about what they're going through and what they're experiencing.
Mhm.
But it's a unique set of circumstances. And today we're going to talk about some of the things that we think kind of contribute to some of the challenges that men have.
Right.
Um, as we go through some of this stuff, it's really interesting because there's this new series on
Yeah.
I think it's Netflix. Um, and so we're going to talk about that a little bit too, because I think that we may end up needing to do a series on
Yeah.
that series,
On that
series
series,
of
right.
podcasts on that series.
Right. Yeah, but we wanted to talk about this because there's something about boys, both boys and men.
Yeah.
We're hearing a lot of talk these days about elementary schools, how elementary schools are really set up for girls. They work much better for girls than boys because boys are so much more active. And there's a lot of talk about are we raising boys well? Are we doing with what they need? Um, because some boys are gentle and seem to be secure and confident
Hmm.
um, in who they are. But many boys and young men, especially, and I think this is true about there's some percentage of young boys, teenagers, teenage boys, and young adult males they just seem to be struggling against the entire world. They're very competitive. There's an underlying anger and irritability. There's a sense of entitlement. We frequently see that well, I'm the man, so I'm entitled to this. This is okay for me to do this. But underneath it all, they're very unhappy. They're kind of miserable in this competitive, angry, I'm better than you world that they sort of create for themselves, or that is created for them.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting as we dig into this topic because, certainly the history, our history has
Mhm.
been very patriarchal and men have had the advantages and it
Mhm.
continues to be, that quote unquote man's world.
Right.
But women are making lots of gains and that's hugely important because I love the movies that come out depicting these periods of time where women were really carrying the heavy loads of things or they
Mhm.
made these huge advancements and
Right.
we don't really history hasn't really paid much attention to them and I think it's great that we're highlighting a lot of that but when you think about when you think about sports, when you think about competitions, like as you said, when you think about all these different things, it's always men that are the focus. I mean, but we still haven't had a female president here in the
Right.
United States. Now, most other countries have had female presidents or prime ministers or
Mhm.
whatnot, and we haven't here in the United States still. Um, and so it's still very much a man's world, especially here in the United States. And
Right.
I think that it contributes to this idea that many of the boys, as you said, they grow up where everything is a competition. They're angry, but there's this underlying perspective of entitlement where it's like they expect that things are just going to work out for them. They expect that they're going to succeed. And when they don't, they
Right.
get really angry about it and they get really upset about it. And I think it has contributed to a lot of the things that we're seeing now, where it's like, well, why does she get a special advantage of something just because she's a woman? But I'm a man and I should be able to have my advantages. And it's a very interesting dynamic that we have going on right now.
Right. There was a time when women had nothing. I mean, they had no rights at all. I mean, Victorian England, when Sigmund Freud practiced, um, women didn't envy men's bodies. They envied their status, their ownership of everything.
Right.
It struck me as we were preparing this podcast that there's nothing comparable to a Super Bowl. I mean, a Super Bowl is a man's sport. I mean, women are there cheerleading and singing doing the halftime show. But the Super Bowl, we just finished the NCAA men's basketball tournament,
Right.
and the world stops. As
Yeah.
March Madness, the entire country stops. They don't stop for women's basketball, though it's becoming more popular. The World Series, the Masters, we just the Masters was played. These are men. There are women golfers. There's a ladies PGA Tour, but there's nothing comparable
Right.
to what men are doing that is garnering all this attention. And it's even true in high school. You take high school sports, it's not girl sports that are popular. There are girl sports, although I fear a little bit of what's going to happen to to these girl sports
Right.
with this talk about diversity and all. But even in high school, it's the high school football players and the girls are cheerleaders.
Right. Well, and it's the high school football team. When you think about fundraising and things like that, it's the high school football team that, even if the high school, maybe it's just a thing here in the South, but it's the high school football team that brings in the most money to the school,
Sure. Yeah.
ticket sales and things like that.
Yeah, and the same with college. College
Right.
sports are men's sport. I mean, by and large, are men's sports.
Right.
Tennis is a little bit different, but generally we see this elevated status of men. So even though women are making gains, and certainly they're making gains in education because there are more women in post-secondary education than men, they're entering the medical profession. We have a story in one of our tests about the first woman to graduate from medical school in the United States. And I think I mentioned this on the podcast before. I worked, I worked in my lifetime. I worked with one of the first female graduates from Johns Hopkins, one of the first female graduates from Johns Hopkins Medical School. And I thought, wait a minute, it's like 1980 something, and you were one of the first women to go to medical school there. And so while women are making some gains in some areas, they this still feels very much like a man's world.
Right. And as when we talk about like the anger, I think that a lot of boys and men feel, I alluded to the Netflix program a few minutes ago. It's called Adolescence. And
Right.
I do think that we need to do a podcast
Right.
series on that show.
Mhm.
But they mentioned something in there, and this is a true statistic that is out there. And, we certainly have our opinions that we will talk about maybe on that series about what this statistic suggests, but they call it the 80/20.
Right.
And what they're saying, what the statistics suggests is that 80% of women want 20% of the men.
Right.
And so it creates this significant dynamic competition between men where everybody wants to be part of the 20% that the 80% of women want.
Right.
And now, again, we will talk at length perhaps about that statistic and where it comes from and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
However,
you're right. The reverse might be true.
right, right,
That 80% of women, 80% of men want 20% of the women.
right.
You know, I I don't know, but
But so,
it's
yeah,
an interesting statistic because it sets up this whole thing about this group is special in some way.
right. And it's and we I think that a lot of these boys, these maybe 20% or so of boys, grow up truly thinking that they're special because they are doing well in school or they are the athletes. And oftentimes it is the athletes that,
Mhm.
have this perspective. And the other 80% of boys are being told that, well, you're not that special. You're not that exceptional. There's
Right.
nothing, significant about you. And and it again contributes to this anger, this resentment, this competition that boys tend to feel. And in no way are we suggesting that women don't feel some of that as well. But I do think it's probably different with women because boys have historically grown up believing that they are the ones that should be succeeding,
Right.
because of the way that our society has been developed and it
Mhm.
has evolved over time. It has been men who have, you know, reached those higher positions, and so the expectation is that, well, if you're a man, that's what you have to aspire to.
Right. Exactly. And I think this 80-20 concept, what I like about it is what it must impose or infuse in these boys, especially teenage boys.
Right.
Okay. Because if you're part of that 20%, if you know you're being sought after
Mhm.
and you're popular and you're desirable and you keep getting this feedback, there is naturally going to be a sense of entitlement that I am a Greek god, I am Adonis, I am wonderful, I am desirable. But then you have this 80% of boys. You remember when Columbine first happened and we had that meeting with James Garbarino
Yeah.
and they had that committee and they said it was the losers killing the winners, that high schools create winners and losers, which is true. Schools create winners and losers,
Right.
athletes and students. And the first explanation, one of the initial explanations of Columbine was that the disenfranchised students, these two boys, were rounding up all of the alpha males and alpha females, and they became the targets. And it was thought that it's the losers getting revenge on the winners. But there is some of that. There is some of that at work here, and I think that we think that that contributes to this attitude of entitlement. And if I don't get what I want, I will take it. And so you have sexual aggression and those sorts of things.
Right.
The other thing that we're dealing with is what we call the Greek ideal. The Greeks had this notion that, the Olympics started with the Greeks, but the Olympics in those years, the ancient Olympics, there was physical perfection, intellectual excellence, and moral virtue. You were expected to be good looking, athletic, and smart, and moral. Moral in the sense of you do things in moderation and you have courage and you have a sense of honor. That's remembered by moral courage. Well, this has been altered. This notion of what if of the perfect specimen. This has been altered over time, and it's especially been altered in the United States. And where we're noticing it now is that there was a long time, many, many years, when women were presented with this impossible figure, that you were expected to look a certain way and to be a certain size. And of course, that's still around today. The Barbie doll, that concept. If Barbie was a real person, she'd what they say, she'd be like 8 feet tall or something, or 7 feet
Yeah,
tall.
it would be completely
Given the
different.
proportion, given
Mhm.
the length of everything, like her neck and her legs and her arms, she would be 7 or 8 feet tall. And there was this whole idea of what is the perfect figure. Well, now boys are expected to look like Olympic athletes and professional athletes when they're 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old before they have developed enough hormones to have that kind of muscle, they're expected to have a six-pack or an eight-pack when they're in high school. And most boys will not be able to do that
Right.
biologically.
Yeah, because in elementary school, everybody's pretty much similar, right? Everybody is sort of everybody for the most part is putting on weight to help prepare for the growth spurt
Right.
and
Mhm.
the arrival of puberty. Now,
Right.
by middle school, it certainly becomes different, and that's where that's where we hear a lot of the boys will be boys.
Mhm.
Boys are starting to do, they're reaching puberty and they are starting to do some of those things that we sometimes excuse as saying, well, boys will be boys, but are also somewhat problematic.
Right.
The way that they idolize, the way that they talk, and the way that they have some of their expectations of each other, but also of girls. And
Mhm.
and then by the time they get high school, you have those who establish themselves well enough in middle school that they have everything that they want, and then you
Right.
have those who didn't, who are, doing without. And so you
Right.
have the haves and have-nots by the time they reach high school. And so, the way that we have been progressing, again, at least in our society, is that by the time boys are reaching high school, again, we have these haves and have-nots, and it all contributes to some of those negative feelings, negative perspectives, the anger, the resentment, the competition, all of that really is fused in
Mhm.
who we are by the time we're
Right.
reaching high school. And there are a lot of lessons that we feel that boys are just learning too late.
Mhm.
Learning
Mhm.
well into it. We're learning some of these things well into adulthood as opposed to, when we should be learning them like in adolescence.
That's right, because the focus during these formative years, during elementary school, middle school, high school, is is it sends all of them, the developmental trajectory is just very, very different.
Right,
And the messages, we're still giving boys those messages. Boys don't cry. Boys don't express their emotions. You're not supposed to, what are you? And there's all kinds of derogatory,
right,
pejorative terms for men boys and men who demonstrate, who express their feelings. We still have a whole vocabulary to describe boys and men who express their feelings.
right,
So while we understand that what boys are going through at this time, we think there's a missing component
right.
in that developmental stew.
Absolutely. And so we're going to start talking about some of the things that we think boys learn too late, and for the rest of this podcast, and we're going to get and finish the list in the next podcast. But the first thing is exactly what you were just saying, and that is that boys tend to, and Richard, I know that you've experienced this too. I work with, an adult man will come in and we'll be working with them, and they just do not understand. They don't know how to identify, they don't know how to acknowledge, they don't know how to correctly label their emotions and their feelings. They don't see that, they don't understand that. And
Right.
because they don't, we've joked, not even joked before, we've acknowledged before that for men, all of these emotions that they experience, sadness, frustration, overwhelmed, tired sometimes, all of these emotions come out as anger.
The anger funnel, right?
Anger funnel, because they haven't learned all these other things. And my goodness, even today, you think about, and we are not going to get into this now, and I'm saying that mostly for myself, so that I'm reminding myself that we're not going to talk a lot about all the DEI stuff
Right.
because and what our government is trying to do right now with squashing some of that. But think about what people say when they talk about DEI in schools and how frustrated some people are, how angry some people are that we are teaching boys some of these things and we are turning them, we are making them gay or we are making them this or that. And no, we are just teaching them their emotions because boys need to know about their emotions just as much as girls.
Right. Exactly. And that's part of the problem right now is
Right.
that this mentality of the strong survive and we have to be tough and we can't be patient and we can't be understanding. That's woke or something. These ugly terms that people come up with to describe this stuff. Well, but we're denying men. We continue to deny men the
Yeah,
opportunity to understand their emotions, to feel all of them, and to
right.
express them accurately, rather than as a single emotion such as anger or irritability.
Right. And you think about we talk about, how relationships and marriages end, 50% of
Mhm.
marriages end,
Right.
and then 50 or 60% of second marriages end. And so much of that is because, if we think about what happens with men is that they don't communicate. They don't
Right.
communicate their emotions and their needs. And we're not teaching them those
Mhm.
those important skills and that important understanding early enough.
Right. Men are not frequently accused of saying things like, "Well, honey, that hurt my feelings when
Right.
you said that." Most men are afraid to utter those words for some reason. I don't
Yeah.
know why, but they simply don't. Instead, they say, "Well, you made me angry," or some version of "you made me angry." So, in the remainder of the podcast, we want to talk about these 10, there are actually 10 things that this writer has identified, things that men learn too late. And the first one of those 10 is acknowledging and expressing our emotions. Okay, that's the first one. Second one is life isn't a competition.
Right.
Many men treat life as a competition,
Right.
that they have to win at everything.
Right.
The best car, the best house, the best yard, the best most everything. And life, you're constantly battling. I think in business they call it a zero-sum game.
Right.
That there's only so much, there are only so many resources, and
Mhm.
you have to make sure you get yours or get more than your share so that you have enough.
Right. And I think it's important. I think competition is important in some aspects because if competition pushes you to be the best version of you, to
Right.
work your hardest,
Mhm.
when we think about competition in sports, for example,
Right.
I think it's hugely important. And I think it's
Mhm.
important for boys and girls to experience some of that and to understand because that's going to teach you what it's like to lose. And it's going to
Mhm.
teach you what it's like to win. And it's going to
Right.
teach you how important work is and how important practice is.
Right.
And so I think competition is critical for those reasons.
Mhm.
However, we get to this point, and you gave good examples where, okay, now we're competing about who has the best yard. Now
Right.
we're competing about who has the best car, who
Mhm.
has the best this and that. And now we're getting into an area where we can reach burnout, we can reach out, lead to, life dissatisfaction with life. There are some people, I have neighbors in my community who they have cars that I'm just not going to be able to, I'm just not going to be able to have a car that's, more luxurious than theirs.
Right.
We have there's a family actually a couple families in my neighborhood where they have two Teslas, you know, or they have matching BMWs and they have
Wow.
or Lexus, and it's like okay, that's fantastic. I'm okay with my Mazda, um,
Mhm.
but if I approached it with this level of competition that a lot of people have, my goodness, I couldn't imagine what level of stress you'd be experiencing because
Right.
you're just not going to live up to that.
Right. Somebody always has more toys.
Always.
Somebody always has more than you do. Okay. So you can have competition. I mean, competition is healthy, can be healthy, but your competition should be about your journey and your
Right.
growth and your happiness. Not what somebody else is doing, but how are you improving and what is that's where the emphasis should be. And
That's
we have to remember that our species survived because we cooperated with each other. We wouldn't have made it as loners. We're not that good at it. We're not hunters, we're not like a leopard. We needed to work together. And I think we still do need to work together to survive. I mean, look
right.
what's happening in the country right now. we're tearing this country apart because we're in competition. We're
Right.
not collaborating. We're not cooperating. We're fighting with each other. We're arguing with each other, calling each other names, and that's what tears countries apart.
Right. Yeah, and that's one thing I like about sports like
Hmm.
swimming and track, because what coaches in those in those areas do is they teach you that the person that you're competing
Right.
against is yourself.
Competing
That's
against you. That's right.
you
Hmm.
know that's why your PR, your personal record, that's why
Hmm.
that's so important. Yeah, you didn't beat all these other people, but you just swam the fastest 100 meters that you've ever swam, and
Right.
that creates that self drive, and so you're competing against yourself, and that can be oftentimes a little bit more healthy than
Right.
other things. Now, the third thing is we do not do a very good job of
With
teaching and
self-care.
ensuring men
Hmm.
understand self-care,
Right.
physical self-care, mental health self-care. They neglect themselves. Um, this especially happens with, if we go back to that 80-20 thing,
Right.
the 80% of guys who see themselves as less worthy, as whatever, you know,
Mm.
man, there are a lot of, I'm just going to say it, Richard. There are a lot of teenage boys that come into my office and they just stink, you know.
Right.
And you ask them a couple of questions, and you find out that they haven't showered in a couple of days, and
Right.
they don't take care of their hair, and it's like, it's not. There's a difference between vanity and
Hmm.
self-care, and
Right.
we don't do a very good job of teaching that.
Hmm. That's right. And it's just something we don't do very much of.
Right.
Many parents come in and say, well, it just doesn't shower. She doesn't take a shower. She doesn't bathe. He doesn't bathe. He doesn't do this. He doesn't do that. It's not a value. That's not valued. We should be taking care of our bodies. And many men, especially after marriage or after they get into a relationship, they let their appearance and hygiene go. They work very hard at it while they're dating, and then they get married and they overweight and they sit in a chair and they don't take care of themselves. They're not attractive. They're not appealing. And so it's another one of those things that many men learn too late, that we should be doing that earlier.
Right.
And then the last thing is to live in the present. And I don't know about you, Bernie, but I struggle a little bit with this notion.
Yeah.
Um, I understand that it's I understand this idea that we get caught in future plans. I mean, most of us do that.
Yeah.
We're we're guilty of that. We think, oh God, when the weekend comes, or when the holiday comes, or when my vacation comes, we
Right.
spend a lot more time planning and looking forward to the future, or we worry about past regrets. We spend a lot of time ruminating about what we didn't do, or what we didn't get, or where we failed. Um, Instead of focusing on what's happening right now.
Right.
This is a sort of an Oriental, Eastern philosophy. Buddhism is very much a part of this, where you live in the present and derive joy um, in the present. Because if you're actively engaged in the present and you're making your present life satisfying, that's will reduce stress and enhance mental health.
Right.
Whereas if you're constantly worrying about the future or regretting the past, you start to introduce stress and unhappiness into your life.
Right. Because I think that the main thing that happens when we aren't attending to where we are at this moment is that we're either chasing
Right.
something that, we did a podcast a couple of months ago on the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
And, when you are constantly living your life trying to get too happy,
Right.
you have to be careful because it can consume you.
Mhm.
So you're either doing that or you're ruminating over things from the past
Right.
that is justification for where you are, or what, this is why nothing ever
Mhm.
worked out because my parents did this and this when I was 5 years old, and yeah, I'm 60 years old now, but nothing ever worked out in my life because my parents divorced when I was 5 years old.
Right.
We can't change any of that stuff. But there are so many people who focus, and Richard, we I keep saying things like this. I remember a person that I've worked with here. a patient who, was an adult, was like 19 or 20 years old when her parents divorced. And she talks about how that ruined her life.
Right.
And
Right.
it's like you were 19. You
Right.
were an adult. You were living on your own.
Hmm.
Your parents divorced. But that focus on this is what happened in my past, and so this is why, nothing has been working out for me.
Right.
It puts us in a situation or in a frame of mind that we're not working towards bettering ourselves. So we have to be very careful of that.
Right. And I think what you have to do is you have to approach each day. I mean, I think there's so many people who hate their jobs, for example.
Right.
So they don't look forward to 5 days out of 7. They get out of bed and they don't want to do what they're doing.
Right.
They're unhappy, they're stressed because they don't look forward. Whereas a person, if you get up every day and you look at just that day and
Right.
say, I'm going to make this day as good as I possibly can, whether it's food or exercise or people you're with, regardless of what it is. I'm going to make this day as good as, because that's what we have.
Right.
We have this day that we have to make, that we have to do well. And this is another thing that we typically don't teach boys and men how to do. It's always when you're older, when you're more mature, when you're faster, when you're bigger, when you're in high school.
Right.
No, live right now. Let's live this life right now. It's something that we learn too late.
Right. Yeah, I think it's definitely a strategy that is important for achieving goals.
Right.
If you want to eat, if you want to change your diet, you don't change your diet for the next 6 months. You change your diet today, and then
Today.
you change
Right.
it tomorrow, and then you're going to change it. It's going to be day by day that you go. So now,
Do well today. Make this day, carpe diem,
right.
seize, that's what it's about.
Absolutely. So
Okay.
there was the first four of the 10 that we're going to talk about. In the next podcast, we're going to go through the remaining
That's up the
six.
other
But
side. Mhm.
um, but definitely things that I think girls need to learn these things too. But we tend to do a little bit better with girls with some of these things than we
Mhm.
do with boys. And so
Right.
um,
Yep.
we're going to be back to talk about the others. And so we'll stop there for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.